Ooh, hey there, welcome to another Ask James, and on this episode we've been flooded with questions like, what's the deal with all these e-bikes, e-trikes, and now e-scooters? Are you really allowed to drive them on the road? Do you really not need a license to ride them? What are the rules around them? So many questions, but hey, that's what we're here for. So let's tackle them one by one on this episode of Ask James.
Now, before we look at the rules and regulations, let's take a look at the space first, because it's a fast-growing space and one that I feel started off on the wrong wheel or foot or whatever you want to call it. Because when it came in, there were no rules and regulations, so this allowed a lot of loopholes, a lot of gray areas, and a lot of businesses decided to capitalize on that by selling them as a no registration, no license necessary, go anywhere type of vehicle. Now, there may have been some truth to that. You certainly don't need to register them and you don't need to have a license to drive them. But this led to other big problems of where and when and how you're supposed to use them. We started seeing them on national roads, we started seeing them on footpaths, people started getting hurt. And this is why this particular question is so important. You see, most developed countries around the world are looking to these as a solution, whereas here in the Philippines, we're just waiting for it to become a problem first. And this is why it's so important to tackle this right now, because as early as now, we can get involved in actually shaping this and incentivizing this as a legitimate alternative form of transport. But while we're waiting for all of that to happen, let's find out where we all stand right now. So with that, I headed over to the LTO. Don't worry, I took a regular vehicle to get the answers straight from the source.
That may be true that they won't have to have their license if they drive it inside a private compound. But once they drive it or they take their unit on public roads, drive it on public roads, they have to have a license to operate a vehicle and a permit to use the vehicle.
Are the LTO making provisions for licensing?
As of now, electric vehicles have no particular category.
So not having a category at the moment is a good thing and a bad thing. Well, obviously the bad thing is it's going to be very difficult to register your EV, even if they do have temporary measures, according to ASEC Galvante. But the good thing here is it allows us a little room to help shape the regulations and turn this into a viable form of alternative transport. But for that to happen, we're going to need a bit of an extra push from a pretty big government department. So what I did is I headed over to the DOE. Actually, I just made a phone call because, well, hey, it's cheaper. We didn't use gas. We saved energy, right?
There is an ongoing United Nations Development Program funded low carbon transport program, and that involves the Department of Transportation, the Department of Energy, the Department of Trade and Industry. And in the preliminary discussions in that program, we did discuss what we call the last mile transport and how we would want to see more alternative modes of transport for that last mile. And I believe that's where those scooters come in.
Okay.
We see it a lot now in these city centers. For example, if you go to Taguig, if you go to BGC, you go to Makati, there's more and more people using it. And like you said, and I agree with that, there has to be a set of rules that would provide how people should use them responsibly.
I can understand or sympathize with the people who are skeptical because they're like, hey, I want to invest into a decent scooter and those are about 80 grand. But I don't want to do that if baka next week bawal na yan.
Yeah.
Is that a concern?
You do want some kind of, as a consumer myself, I also own a scooter. I do understand where you're coming from. You do want to ensure that there's no sudden change in rules and find overnight that it's suddenly illegal to use them on certain streets. What would be reasonable to see from the government would be a set of rules where they probably won't allow those scooters on national roads or on the roads themselves, but they would probably allow it on sidewalks.
Yes.
More often than not, some of these regulations would probably be patterned on regulations that are already existing in major tourism cities in the world. We do know that there's a set of regulations that are being developed in France. In Paris, it's become a problem for them. I recently came back from Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles. And on that trip, I did see a lot of scooters being used in the city.
You saw the rentals?
And I do know that they're developing the rentals. Of course, the amazing apps, Bird, Lime. There was another one, Skip, I think.
Yes.
And I do know that they're developing regulations as well. So I think the Philippine government would approach a commonsensical, pragmatic approach to it. And we would probably pattern it after the regulations that we see in these cities where it's taking off.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Ask James. We hope we've answered some of your questions, and well, comes down to this for me. They are a great form of transport. I think the e-bikes, e-trikes, and now the e-scooters can really solve a lot of little problems, especially in the tight urban centers. But this requires proper framework for them. They need new legislation, they need new framework, new guidelines, something where we can all sort of be on the same page, because people are not going to want to invest in that if they're not clear about the rules around using them. What's important also is not just knowing the rules, it's also being able to incentivize the use of them. There's a lot of areas that could really get decongested if we told people the way to use this properly. As long as they find it a more efficient way, they will flock to it. It's up to us now to make sure we steer them in that right direction. Remember, anything that takes a private car off the road is going to be a good thing in terms of traffic. Then it has the added advantage of being really kind to the environment. It doesn't use any gas. It charges up with around 10 or 12 pesos. That will get you about 90 kilometers. You can't beat that with any kind of fossil fuel powered car or vehicle.